Hello, folks. Welcome to a new week. Welcome back to North Carolina. I'm going to be much more consistent this week. So thanks for all your grace with all of the traveling. But we're jumping back in where we left off. So we're on Genesis 31 and 32. And what we're basically seeing in Genesis 31 is a lot of tension between Jacob and Laban. Tension because they're jealous of each other, they're suspicious of each other, they both want to have the upper hand, they both want to be the alpha male, and the relationship is broken down because they're not fully trusting of each other. And as I read through Genesis 31 and 32, there were 4 words that came to mind for me: remember, trust, ask, and cling. And so I'm just going to take a moment to pick out a few of those. Firstly, remember. God is encouraging Jacob to remember where he's come from, to return to where he's come from, and to remember how good God has been to him and how he has made vows to God. So at the beginning, he encourages Jacob to return to the land of your fathers and your people, and I will be with you. Remember where you've come from. Remember that there, where I made you this promise, there was goodness, there was faithfulness, there was peace. And later on in verse 13, he says, I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. Sometimes the best thing that we can ask God to do is just remind us where we've come from and how good he's been to us through the years. And here, in all of Jacob's kind of scheming and some of the things we've talked about in previous videos, some of his taking into control his situation, trying to take it into his own hands and make decisions in his own strength, God is saying, remember. Go back and remember. Go back to where you came from. Remember who you are. Remember what you've told me. And sometimes when we get a bit confused or lose our own way, remembering can be the greatest gift to us. The second thing is trust. God takes Jacob to a place where he trusts him. And you can see here there's sort of a secrecy to Jacob leaving. He says he leaves in the dead of night. He takes out all of his family and his possessions and his livestock, and he kind of gets away in the dead of night in the secret place. Rachel steals these idols that belong to her father. There's something still a little bit underhanded and a little bit deceptive or not fully open about the way that Jacob and his family are conducting themselves. But God is bringing them to a place of trust. He even goes to Jacob's father-in-law in a dream and says, don't go near Jacob. I'm in charge of his life. Like, don't speak to him for good or bad. Leave him to it. And we've got to learn to trust that God is going to deliver us from the situations in our life that are hard. God is going to see us out of injustice or times when we're perhaps not being given all that we should be given or not being taken seriously. We've got to still trust that God has got our reputation, he's got our future, he's got our provision. And I just think it's really interesting here that Jacob and Laban make an agreement, they make a pact. And so often in the Bible we see these pacts, these agreements, these covenants, and they're often covenants of peace where two people say, the strife between us is over, we're going to move forward together. But this is not a pact of peace, it's a pact of separation. They're basically saying, we're not going to have anything more to do with each other because this situation is not good. And we've got to trust that sometimes God is going to lead us away from some people and some situations for our own good. Jacob, to some degree, is prospering in this situation. He's growing in riches, he's growing in livestock, his empire, his little family is growing. But God is saying, it's time to separate. It's time for you to move away from all that Laban represents to you, which really is things of the world. Getting rich in your own strength, creating for yourself your own kingdom, building for yourself your own security. God says it's time to separate from that. And sometimes we have to trust God when he removes things from our life, removes opportunities, and even maybe removes relationships. We have to trust him because it's often for our own good. When we look at the beginning of Genesis 32, it says, Jacob went on his way and the angels of God met him. Now, the chances are the angels were always close to him, but he didn't see them because he was too close to the other distractions of the world, Laban's way of living, the way that builds up our own riches. But as he stepped away from those things, as he separated and made this pact to say, I'm not going to walk your way anymore, we can't we can't do this together, we want different things. Then his eyes are opened, and suddenly we start hearing about angels, and we start hearing about the Lord speaking to him and even convicting him and instructing him to go and make peace with his brother. There's something of clarity that's come upon Jacob as he's separated from some of the things that were there before, as he was greedy and envious and perhaps a little bit wrong in his priorities of seeking his own kingdom. So we've got trust. Then we see Jacob in this kind of dilemma of the intimidation at the thought of meeting his brother Esau. Now, Jacob was never really intimidated by Laban, his father-in-law. He wasn't really intimidated by him. He was sneaky. He was a bit stealthy. He didn't do things above board. But he wasn't intimidated, and I think that's because he knew in that situation he was in the right. He was being cheated out of some of his wage. He wasn't being fairly treated. With Esau, he's nervous and intimidated, probably because he's in the wrong. He knows that he's in the wrong. He knows that he was the one who cheated his brother. He was the one who stole the birthright and manipulated the situation in order to win. And I think sometimes we have to remember that our past has consequences. Some of that is guilt that we have to repent for. Some of it's shame that we have to take to God. Some of it's forgiveness that we need to go and seek from a person in our lives. But you see here that Jacob is bothered by the thought of going and seeing his brother, because he knows that actually that relationship ended mostly because of his decisions. And as he's wrestling with this and wondering how he's going to get through it, he ultimately, in 32 verse 9, begins to pray and begins to ask God to help him. O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, you who said to me, return to my country and my kindred, I'm not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and faithfulness that you've shown to me. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother. After all of his scheming and planning and doing everything in his own strength, he finally resorts to prayer. And we have to be willing to walk through the whole journey sometimes in our own lives. We can try and barricade ourselves from feeling shame or guilt. We can try and distract ourselves or even lie to ourselves that we shouldn't feel that way. But ultimately, the best way to deal with it is going to be to repent and surrender and pray and ask God, please help me in these things where I've gone wrong, where I haven't led myself well in the past. He comes to God and he asks for help. And this is kind of a first for Jacob. He's made some demands of God. He's tried to live in God's strength without really humbling himself. But now here he is at the prospect of seeing his brother actually saying, God, please help me. Please help me. And there's such strength in that posture. And then finally, we see this really interesting passage at the end of Genesis 32 where he wrestles with an angel, with God, we don't know. But it says he sends all of his people on ahead of him. And sometimes God needs to get us alone to really get our attention. But he's alone. And at the break of day, it says that he's wrestling with God. And the man or God, the angel says, let me go now. And Jacob clings and clings and clings on and says, I'm not going to let go until I've seen the fulfillment of this promise on my life. I'm not going to let go until he bless me. And I think the final word that came to mind for me for this passage is just that clinging on to God when we're not sure what else to do. So Jacob, over the last few chapters, he's kind of lost his way. He's not shown his best self. Perhaps he never has up until this point, but the promise of God is on his life. And God has said, I'm with you and I'm with your forefathers and I'm with your future and I'm going to bless you. But here in this chapter, we see a bit of a turnaround for Jacob. And it looks like remembering where he came from, trusting that God will see him through, asking God for help and then clinging to him when he doesn't know where else to look. So it's it feels like a bit of a turnaround for me in the story of Jacob, and we're going to see his character and his countenance change in the next few chapters as he continues to walk out that humility. Those are the words that came to mind for me. If there were other words that came to mind for you, please let me know, and we'll jump into 33 and 34 tomorrow.